Hello, dear friends. Today I will bring you a story that you will surely love. Prepare your seats, fasten your seatbelts, and let's explore the story together right now. At 65 years old, Edward Carlyle, a millionaire, made an unexpected decision, marrying an unconventional woman on a dare. Edward lived in a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of Manhattan. His estate was a testament to wealth, with grand marble facades, a crystal-clear pool surrounded by lush gardens, and a vintage car collection that inspired envy. Yet, despite the splendor, Edward's home felt empty and lifeless. His wife, Amelia, had passed away over a decade ago. Amelia had been more than his spouse. She was his partner, his confidant, and his guiding star. Without her, no amount of business success or extravagant parties could fill the void she left behind. Over the years, Edward became a reserved man, his humor tinged with sarcasm and a hint of arrogance. His wealthy friends often encouraged him to remarry. "You can't live in the past forever," they'd say. But Edward dismissed the idea, doubting he could find love a second time. In a quiet suburb nearby, 38-year-old Laura Bennett began her day at her bakery, Sweet Haven. Laura poured her heart into her work, crafting pastries that radiated warmth and care. She was a curvy woman, often the target of judgmental stares, but she wore her kindness and strength like armor. To her customers, her bakery was more than a shop. It was a place of comfort and love. Beneath her cheerful demeanor, Laura longed for someone who could see and cherish her true self. On quiet evenings, she'd gaze at the stars from her small apartment, wondering if such a person existed. One brisk autumn evening, Edward attended a lavish party hosted by his longtime friend, Victor. The penthouse buzzed with jazz, laughter, and clinking glasses of fine wine. Holding a glass of whiskey, Edward stood among his peers as they chatted about luxury cars, investments, and, predictably, beautiful women. "You should really consider remarrying, Edward," Victor teased, patting him on the shoulder. "A man like you shouldn't spend his life alone." Edward smirked. "I've done fine by myself all these years. I don't need anyone." "You're lying to yourself," Victor pressed, his grin sly. "Or are you just scared of falling in love again?" The group laughed, emboldened by their drinks. One guest, his eyes glinting mischievously, chimed in. "If love isn't your goal, why not marry for fun? I dare you to marry someone completely unexpected. Someone like Laura Bennett." Edward raised an eyebrow as laughter erupted. "Who's that?" "She runs a little bakery in the suburbs," the man replied. "Not your type at all." Sensing the group's amusement, Victor leaned in. "What do you say, Edward? Take the challenge." Fueled by whiskey and pride, Edward smirked. "Fine. If you all want a good laugh, consider it done. Let's call it an experiment." That night, as Edward lay in his massive, empty bed, a strange unease settled over him. On the surface, the dare seemed harmless, a frivolous way to pass the time. Yet, deep within, he felt an inexplicable doubt. Brushing it aside, he resolved to see it through, unaware that this impulsive choice would change his life forever. To Edward, it was all meant to be a joke. What he didn't anticipate was that meeting Laura would challenge everything he thought he knew, not just about her, but about himself. It would force him to face the man he had become and rediscover the true essence of love and purpose. The next morning, Edward Carlyle stood before the grand mirror in his bedroom, adjusting the cuffs of his finely tailored suit. Outwardly, he exuded confidence, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. What exactly was he doing? The night before, under the haze of whiskey and the playful jeers of his friends, it had all seemed harmless. But now, as he prepared to walk into the bakery where Laura worked, the gravity of his decision began to settle over him. "Just a bit of fun," Edward muttered, brushing an invisible speck off his lapel. Nothing serious. With that, he slid into his luxury car and made his way to Sweet Haven, the bakery that had earned a loyal following in the quiet neighborhood. The moment Edward stepped inside, the warm scent of freshly baked bread, cinnamon, and sugar enveloped him, a stark contrast to the cold sterility of the upscale venues he usually frequented. Shelves were laden with perfectly iced cupcakes, hearty loaves of bread, and jars of vibrant homemade jam. The soft chime of the bell above the door announced his arrival, and a woman behind the counter looked up. Her hands dusted with flour, Laura greeted him with a warm smile. "Good morning. Welcome to Sweet Haven. How can I help you?" Edward took a moment to study her. She was as his friends had described, full-figured, with a round, kind face framed by auburn curls. But what they hadn't mentioned was the sparkle in her eyes or the genuine warmth in her tone. For a brief moment, he forgot why he was there. "I'm Edward," he said, clearing his throat and managing a polite smile. "I've heard great things about this place and thought I'd see for myself." "Well, you've come to the right spot," Laura replied, brushing her hands on her apron. "Everything here is made fresh daily. Would you like to try something?" Edward's gaze drifted over the display case, more out of habit than hunger. "What would you recommend?" Laura's face lit up. "Our cinnamon rolls are a favorite. Or, if you're in the mood for something savory, the cheddar scones are to die for." Caught off guard by her enthusiasm, Edward chuckled. "I'll take a cinnamon roll, then." As Laura carefully placed the pastry in a small box, Edward hesitated. He hadn't planned on lingering, just a quick introduction to set the dare in motion. But there was something disarming about her. "Do you run this place all by yourself?" he asked, leaning casually against the counter. "I do," Laura replied, handing him the box. "It's a lot of work, but I love it. Baking isn't just about food, it's about bringing people joy." Edward raised an eyebrow, genuinely intrigued despite himself. "Joy." Laura nodded. "Food has a way of connecting people. It reminds them of home, of comfort. I like to think I'm not just baking bread, I'm baking memories." Her words hung in the air, resonating in a way Edward hadn't expected. This wasn't the shallow, self-absorbed woman he'd imagined. There was a depth to her, a sincerity that felt foreign in his world of pretense and superficiality. "Well," he said finally, "it seems like you've found your calling." Laura smiled, her cheeks tinged with a faint blush. "And what about you, Mr. Carlyle? What brings you here?" Edward hesitated, the truth catching in his throat. Instead, he donned his most charming smile. "Curiosity, and maybe a bit of hunger." Laura laughed, a soft, genuine sound that caused an unexpected tightness in Edward's chest. For the first time in years, something stirred within him, something he couldn't quite explain. A pang of guilt flickered in Edward's chest, but he quickly buried it. This was all part of the plan. Over the next few days, Edward returned to Sweet Haven, playing the role of a loyal customer. Each visit, he made a point to engage Laura in conversation, gradually building a rapport. She was always warm, always quick with a smile or kind word. Her easy demeanor was infectious, and Edward found himself lingering far longer than he intended. It wasn't long before he decided to take the next step. One sunny afternoon, as Laura wiped down the counter, Edward cleared his throat. "Laura," he began, "I've really enjoyed getting to know you these past few days. You have a way of making people feel at ease." Laura looked up, her surprise giving way to a shy smile. "Thank you, Edward. That means a lot." "Well," he continued, shifting his stance slightly, "I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me sometime. Just the two of us." For a moment, Laura froze, her expression a mix of disbelief and hesitation. Men like Edward didn't usually notice women like her. Was this a joke? A pity invitation? Or was he genuinely interested? I'm flattered, she said at last. But why me? Surely you have plenty of other options. Edward smiled, leaning in just slightly. Because you're different, Laura. You're real, and that's rare. The sincerity in his voice took her by surprise. After a brief pause, she nodded. All right, Edward. Dinner it is. That evening, as Edward drove home, his emotions swirled. On one hand, he felt a sense of accomplishment, another step in completing the dare. On the other, he couldn't deny the growing respect and admiration he felt for Laura. She wasn't like the women he typically associated with. She was genuine, unpretentious, and unapologetically herself. For Laura, the invitation left her feeling conflicted. She was flattered, even excited. But a small voice in the back of her mind planted doubts. Why would someone like Edward be interested in her? Was she misinterpreting his kindness? Still, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. Neither of them could foresee that this simple dinner would be the start of something deeper and transformative, something neither had planned for. In the weeks that followed, Edward found himself spending more and more time at Sweet Haven. What had begun as a frivolous dare was morphing into something he couldn't quite define. Each visit, he would settle at a small table by the window, sipping coffee and watching Laura work. She moved through the bakery with effortless grace, her warmth radiating with every interaction. Her laughter was a melody that filled the room, drawing people in. At first, Edward had seen Laura as the subject of a joke, a pawn in a game devised by his friends. But now, he was beginning to see her in a very different light. One quiet afternoon, after the lunch rush had passed, Laura approached his table with a slice of apple pie. She set it down in front of him. "On the house," she said with a smile. Edward raised an eyebrow. "You trying to spoil me?" "Maybe," she replied, sitting across from him. "Or maybe I thought you could use something sweet to go with all those serious thoughts." Edward chuckled. "Am I that obvious?" Laura leaned back, studying him. "You've got this look sometimes, like you're carrying the weight of the world. A man like you shouldn't have so many worries." Her words struck a chord. Edward hesitated, then replied, "Let's just say I've lived long enough to know that money doesn't solve everything." Laura nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's true. But it can buy cinnamon rolls," she added with a playful grin. Edward laughed, genuinely, for the first time in what felt like years. Edward was amused by their conversations, often light-hearted yet layered with depth. Laura had a way of making him feel truly seen, breaking through his defenses without even trying. She shared stories of her childhood in a small town, learning to bake from her grandmother, and her dream of one day expanding the bakery. "Not because I want to get rich or anything," she said one day, her eyes alight with passion. "I just want to reach more people, make them feel at home, even if just for a little while." Edward found himself drawn to her sincerity. She wasn't chasing wealth or status. She craved connection. It was a stark contrast to the shallow ambitions of the people he was used to. For the first time in years, he began questioning his own life choices. As their bond deepened, Laura couldn't shake the growing unease. Why would a sophisticated, wealthy man like Edward Carlyle spend so much time with someone like her? One evening, as they sat on a park bench after dinner, she decided to voice her thoughts. "Edward," she began hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied, turning to her. "Why me?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, look at you," she said, gesturing toward him. "You're a millionaire. You could be with anyone you want. So why are you here, spending time with someone like me?" Edward's heart skipped a beat. How could he explain the dare without destroying the fragile connection they had built? "I'm here because I want to be," he said finally, his voice steady. "You're unlike anyone I've ever met, Laura. You're kind, genuine, and real. That's rare in my world." Laura searched his eyes, looking for any sign of insincerity. She wanted to believe him, but a small part of her held on to doubt. "All right," she said softly, "but I hope you're being honest with me, Edward. I don't think I could handle it if you weren't." Her words lingered with him long after he dropped her off that night. The guilt simmering beneath the surface was now impossible to ignore. Despite his turmoil, Edward continued to pursue Laura. He craved her laughter, her warmth, and the way she made him feel like more than just a wealthy old man. But as his feelings for her deepened, so did the pressure to fulfill the dare. One evening, as they strolled through the city after dinner, Edward made a decision. "Laura," he said, stopping to face her. She looked up, curiosity in her eyes. "Yes?" "I've been thinking a lot about us," he began, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. "And I realize that I don't want this, whatever this is, to end." Laura tilted her head, confused. "What are you saying, Edward?" Taking a deep breath, he said, "I want to marry you." Her eyes widened in shock. "Marry me?" "Yes," he said, taking her hands in his. "I know it's sudden, but I feel like we have something special. I don't want to waste any more time." For a moment, Laura was speechless. She had dreamed of finding love, but she had never expected a proposal like this, so sudden, so grand. "Edward, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he urged, his heart pounding. Laura hesitated, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to say yes, to believe this was real, but another part couldn't shake her lingering doubts. "Let me think about it," she said finally. Edward nodded, masking his disappointment. "Take all the time you need." That night, as Edward returned to his empty mansion, he was overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. The dare had started as a game, a harmless joke, but now it was so much more. He didn't just want to win the bet, he wanted Laura. Meanwhile, Laura lay awake in her small apartment, her heart torn between hope and fear. She wanted to believe in Edward's sincerity, but the voice of doubt was louder than ever. Neither of them could predict that their next steps would bring a turning point, challenging everything they thought they knew about love and trust. It was a crisp autumn evening, and Edward had invited Laura to a lavish party hosted by one of his wealthy friends. The grand estate buzzed with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of live jazz music. Laura hesitated at first, feeling out of place among the elite crowd. But Edward had reassured her. "You're with me," he said, gently squeezing her hand. Edward held Laura's hand firmly as they entered the glittering ballroom. "That's all that matters," he had told her earlier, reassuring her nervousness. Dressed in an elegant navy blue gown Edward had insisted on buying for her, Laura couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and unease. She stayed close to him, her arm looped through his, as they navigated the sea of strangers casting curious glances her way. As the evening progressed, Edward stepped away briefly to speak with the host, leaving Laura near the buffet table. She busied herself studying the ornate decor, hoping to blend into the background. That was when she overheard them, two men standing nearby, holding glasses of champagne and laughing quietly. "Can you believe he actually went through with it?" one of them said, smirking. "I know," the other replied. "Marrying her? I mean, look at her. All this just to win a stupid dare." Laura froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Typical Edward, though," the first man continued, shaking his head, "always taking things too far. But hey, it's entertaining for the rest of us." Their laughter felt like daggers, slicing through the fragile confidence Laura had built over the past few weeks. Her vision blurred as tears welled up in her eyes. She didn't need to hear more. She had heard enough. Clutching her small handbag tightly, she turned and walked briskly toward the exit, her heart pounding in her chest. Edward noticed her retreating figure and quickly excused himself, weaving through the crowd to catch up with her. Laura, he called, his voice tinged with alarm. She didn't stop. Only when she reached the quiet gardens outside did she turn to face him, her expression a mixture of anger and heartbreak. Is it true? She demanded, her voice trembling. Edward frowned, confused. What are you talking about? She took a shaky breath. Your friends. I heard them. They said you were only marrying me because of some dare. The color drained from Edward's face. Laura, Just tell me the truth, she interrupted, her voice rising. Was this all a game to you? Am I just some joke you and your friends cooked up for entertainment? Edward opened his mouth, then closed it, the weight of her accusation settling heavily on his shoulders. Finally, he looked down, ashamed. At first, he admitted quietly, it was a dare. Laura let out a bitter laugh, tears streaming down her face. I knew it. I knew this was too good to be true. But it's not what you think, Edward said quickly, stepping closer. Yes, it started as a stupid bet, but that's not why I'm here now. That's not why I asked you to marry me. She shook her head, taking a step back. How can I believe anything you say? You lied to me, Edward. You made me believe you cared about me when all along I was just part of your little game. Edward's chest tightened. Laura, please. I know I messed up, but my feelings for you are real. You've changed me in ways I didn't think were possible. You've made me see the world differently, made me see myself differently. Laura's lips quivered as she looked at him, searching his eyes for any trace of sincerity. If you cared about me, she said softly, you wouldn't have lied to me. Edward reached out, his voice desperate. Laura, don't go. Please, let me prove to you that this is real. But Laura shook her head, tears falling freely now. I can't do this, Edward. I deserve someone who sees me for who I am, not as part of some sick joke. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Edward standing alone in the garden, his heart heavy with regret. For the first time in years, Edward felt the sting of true loss. He had thought he could control everything in his life, but Laura had unraveled that illusion. She wasn't just part of a game. She had become someone he deeply cared about, someone he couldn't bear to lose. As he watched her disappear into the night, Edward realized his actions had brought him to this moment. Now, it was up to him to decide if he could earn back the trust he had so carelessly broken. Edward hadn't anticipated the full extent of the consequences his choices would bring. The dare might have been the catalyst, but it was his own actions that had driven Laura away. Now, he was left to confront the reality of his mistakes. The days after Laura walked away were the loneliest of Edward's life. The emptiness of his sprawling mansion seemed to echo louder with every passing hour. For the first time, Edward felt the weight of his choices. He realized how deeply he had hurt Laura, not just guilt consuming him, but love. Genuine, undeniable love. He thought of her warmth, her laughter, and her resilience. The way she found beauty in life's challenges. Edward had spent years searching for meaning, only to find it in the person he had so carelessly pushed away. That night, sitting alone in his study, Edward made a decision. He would change, not with empty promises or grand gestures, but through actions that proved his sincerity. The next morning, Edward drove to Sweet Haven. As he entered, the familiar jingle of the bell above the door sounded. Seeing Laura behind the counter made his heart ache. When she looked up and saw him, her smile faded. Edward, she said, her tone guarded. What are you doing here? I came to apologize, he replied, his voice steady but full of emotion, and to make things right. There's nothing to make right, Laura said, turning back to arrange a tray of muffins. You got what you wanted, didn't you? The dare is over. You can move on now. Edward stepped closer, his expression earnest. I don't care about the dare anymore. I care about you, Laura. I care about us. Laura froze, her hands tightening on the tray. It's too late, Edward, she said softly. I can't trust you. I know, Edward admitted, but I'm asking for a chance to prove that I'm not the man I was. Please, let me show you. Over the next few weeks, Edward began showing up at the bakery every morning. At first, Laura tried to ignore him, but he was persistent. He didn't just sit idly. He rolled up his sleeves and offered to help. You don't know the first thing about baking, she said one day, watching him struggle with a rolling pin. Then teach me, he replied, his smile lopsided but genuine. I want to learn. Reluctantly, Laura began showing him the basics. She kept her guard up, but Edward's determination never wavered. His early attempts were clumsy. He spilled flour everywhere, burned cookies, and once dropped an entire tray of cupcakes. Yet he never gave up, and slowly, he improved. One day, as they worked side by side kneading dough, Laura finally asked, "Why are you doing this, Edward? You don't belong here." "I'm doing this because I want to understand you," he said simply. "Your world, your passion, your kindness. It's what drew me to you, and it's what I want to be part of." Laura didn't respond, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was being honest. Edward's transformation didn't stop at the bakery. Inspired by Laura's selflessness, he began reevaluating his life. He sold his collection of luxury cars, using the proceeds to fund a program that provided meals to low-income families. He joined local volunteer efforts, rolling up his sleeves to distribute food and supplies. When asked why he was doing it, Edward would simply say, "Because I've been given so much, and it's time I gave back." Word of his efforts began to spread, and even Laura couldn't ignore the changes he was making. Customers at the bakery often shared stories of seeing Edward at food drives or helping out at shelters. "He's different now," an elderly customer remarked to Laura one morning. "Whatever he's doing, it's coming from the heart." One rainy afternoon, as Sweet Haven closed for the day, Edward lingered by the door. Laura sighed, sensing he had something to say. "I made this for you," he said, holding out a slightly lopsided apple pie. Laura raised an eyebrow, accepting the pie. "You baked this?" "With a lot of help from the recipe," he admitted, his cheeks reddening. "But yes, I wanted to make something for you to show how much I appreciate everything you've taught me." Laura stared at the pie, then at Edward. For the first time in weeks, she didn't see the man who had hurt her, but the man who was earnestly and humbly trying to make amends. "You're really not giving up, are you?" she asked softly. "Not on you," Edward said firmly. "Not ever." Though still cautious, Laura couldn't deny that Edward's actions spoke louder than words. He had stepped out of his privileged world to immerse himself in hers, learning and giving without expecting anything in return. One evening, as they closed up the bakery, Laura finally turned to him and said, Maybe we can start over, as friends." Edward smiled, his heart lifting. "I'd like that." It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, but it was a start, a chance to rebuild what he had broken. For Edward, that was more than enough. Months passed. Edward's continued presence at the bakery slowly worked its way into Laura's life. Despite her initial resistance, she began to open up. Their friendship deepened with each passing day. But Edward knew it wasn't enough. Laura wasn't just someone he wanted to make amends with. She was the person who had reignited his capacity to love and live meaningfully. He wanted to show her that she was more than a dare, more than a step toward redemption. So Edward decided to do something extraordinary. He spent weeks preparing, pouring his heart into every detail. With the help of Sophia, one of Laura's closest friends and a loyal customer, he secretly reached out to those who knew and cared for Laura, her neighbors, childhood friends, and even a few of her regular customers. The plan was simple: to organize an intimate celebration honoring the woman who had brought so much light to their lives. The venue? Where it all began, Sweet Haven. On the morning of the event, Edward arrived early to help decorate. Balloons, fairy lights, and bouquets of Laura's favorite flowers transformed the cozy shop into a magical space. He even commissioned a local artist to paint a portrait of the bakery, featuring Laura smiling behind the counter, a perfect capture of her essence. When everything was ready, Edward stood back, surveying the room. This wasn't just a surprise party. It was a declaration of his love and gratitude. Laura had no idea what awaited her. After closing the bakery for the evening, she was surprised when Sophia showed up, insisting she come back inside. "What's going on?" Laura asked, suspicious but intrigued. "Just trust me," Sophia replied with a mischievous grin. As they stepped inside, Laura froze. The room was filled with familiar faces, all beaming at her. "Surprise!" they shouted in unison. Tears welled up in Laura's eyes as she took in the scene. The bakery had been transformed, glowing with warmth and love. At the center of the room stood Edward, holding a microphone, looking both nervous and determined. What is this?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. Edward stepped forward, his heart pounding. "This," he said, "is for you, Laura. For everything you've done. Not just for me, but for everyone here." Taking a deep breath, Edward addressed the room. "When I first met Laura," he began, his voice steady, "I didn't deserve to know someone like her. I was selfish, careless, and blind to what truly matters in life. She was supposed to be part of a joke, a meaningless dare." Gasps rippled through the room, but Edward pressed on, his eyes never leaving Laura's. "But what I didn't realize was that Laura would change my life. She showed me what kindness looks like, what strength truly means. She made me see the world through her eyes, full of love, hope, and generosity. And for that, I will always be grateful." He stepped closer, his voice softening. "Laura, I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to know that every moment we've spent together since that terrible mistake has been real. I love you, not because of who I thought you were, but because of who you are. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." The room fell silent, all eyes on Laura as tears streamed down her face. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Her heart raced, torn between the pain of the past and the undeniable sincerity in Edward's words. She looked around the room, seeing the people who had come together because of him and feeling the warmth of their support. Finally, she stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Edward, what you did hurt me more than I can put into words. I've spent my whole life being overlooked, judged, and treated as less than. When I found out that I was just part of a joke, it broke something inside me." Edward's shoulders sagged, guilt etched into his face. "But," Laura continued, her voice growing steadier, "I've also seen how much you've changed. You didn't just say you were sorry, you showed it. Every day, in every action, you've proven that you're not the man who made that mistake anymore." She paused, her eyes searching his. "And while it's hard for me to trust again, I think you're worth the risk." A ripple of relief and joy washed over Edward as Laura smiled through her tears. "Does that mean?" he began, his voice breaking slightly. "It means I'll give us a chance," she said, taking his hands in hers. The room erupted in applause as Edward and Laura embraced. It wasn't just a celebration of their relationship. It was a testament to the power of growth, forgiveness, and second chances. As the evening continued, laughter and love filled the bakery. Laura's friends shared stories about her kindness and resilience, while Edward stood by her side, beaming with pride. Later that night, as they stood outside under the stars, Laura looked up at Edward and said with a teasing smile, "You know, this doesn't mean I'll go easy on you in the kitchen. Edward laughed, his heart lighter than it had been in years. I wouldn't have it any other way. In that moment, Laura realized something important. Love isn't about perfection or fairy tales. It's about choosing to trust, to forgive, and to build something real together. For Edward, this wasn't the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a life filled with purpose, guided by the love of the woman who had taught him what it truly meant to live. Edward and Laura's wedding was nothing like the lavish ceremonies Edward's old world was accustomed to. It wasn't held in a grand ballroom or at an exotic destination, but in the backyard of Sweet Haven, surrounded by close friends, family, and loyal customers. Under a canopy of twinkling fairy lights and the warm glow of the evening sun, the couple exchanged vows. Laura wore a simple, elegant dress, her radiant smile brighter than any diamond. Edward, dressed in a classic suit, looked at her with an expression that spoke volumes of his transformation. Gone was the man who once saw life as a series of transactions. Standing there now was a man deeply in love, humbled by the journey that had brought him to this moment. As they said, "I do," a wave of cheers and applause swept through the crowd. For Laura, it was a moment of vindication, a testament that love, when genuine, could surpass any hurt or doubt. For Edward, it was a second chance, not just at love, but at life itself. After the wedding, Edward and Laura set about creating a life that reflected their shared values. Together, they transformed Sweet Haven into more than just a bakery. It became a community hub, a place where people could come for delicious treats as well as connection and support. Edward used his resources to expand the bakery into a non-profit initiative, providing free baking classes for underprivileged youth and employing people in need of a second chance. Inspired by Laura's philosophy of spreading joy through food, they launched a Pay What You Can't program, ensuring no one in their community would go hungry. What had started as a dare had blossomed into a life of purpose and love. For Edward and Laura, their journey wasn't just about redemption. It was about building something meaningful together, one act of kindness at a time. Regardless of financial circumstances, Laura and Edward's partnership became a beacon of hope. Laura's warmth and Edward's determination created a bond that was both practical and profound. Together, they worked tirelessly to bring kindness and support to others. For Edward, this chapter of life was a stark departure from his past. No longer preoccupied with material wealth or shallow relationships, he found fulfillment in life's simple joys. Sharing a laugh with Laura over a batch of misfired cookies, witnessing the excitement of a child in a baking class, or watching the sunrise with her on quiet mornings gave his life new meaning. Laura, too, transformed. For the first time, she felt truly seen and valued, not for her appearance or what she could provide, but for who she was. With Edward by her side, she grew more confident in herself and her dreams. Together, they were a team, uplifting, challenging, and inspiring each other to be better while creating a life filled with love and purpose. Their story began to inspire others. Local newspapers featured articles about the millionaire and the baker who had turned a chance meeting into a beautiful partnership. But Edward and Laura weren't interested in attention. For them, it was about making a difference, one small act of kindness at a time. They became mentors, sharing their journey with others who struggled to believe in love or themselves. Their honesty about their trials, the mistakes, doubts, and pain, made their story relatable and inspiring. "It's not about how you start," Edward often said. "It's about where you choose to go from there." One crisp autumn morning, Edward and Laura stood outside Sweet Haven, hand in hand. The bakery was bustling as usual, with customers coming and going, their laughter and conversations filling the air. "Remember when all of this was just a dream?" Laura asked softly. Edward squeezed her hand gently. "I remember when I almost ruined it all," he said. "But you gave me a chance to make things right." I'll never stop being grateful for that. Laura smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. And I'll never stop being grateful for you, for seeing past everything and choosing me. As the morning sun bathed them in golden light, they stood there together, a living symbol of what love could achieve. Their story wasn't about perfection or fairy tales. It was about growth, forgiveness, and the courage to embrace imperfection. Laura and Edward's journey reminds us that love isn't defined by appearances, wealth, or grand gestures. It's built on understanding, honesty, and the willingness to change for the better. Even the most broken beginnings can lead to extraordinary endings when met with humility and sincerity. Perhaps the most important lesson their story teaches is that true beauty lies not in how the world sees us, but in how we choose to see ourselves and others. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of love, redemption, and transformation. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales that celebrate the beauty of the human spirit. Until next time, remember, true love always finds a way.